December 1 of 2021, Officer Andrew Steinbercher led a task force looking for Mr. Joker. Mr. Joker was the suspect in a rape of a 15-year-old girl the previous weekend. He was also the suspect in a shooting of the alleged victim's residence after she reported the rape to the police. The victim told police that Mr. Joker had her iPhone, so the task force tracked the phone using the victim's Find My Phone app. Officers tracked the victim's iPhone to a tan GMC Yukon with tinted windows near West Kearns Elementary. Police followed the Yukon to 4100 South, then eastbound until 9 p.m. when the Yukon pulled into up to a gas pump on the 7-Eleven on the southwest corner at the intersection of 4100 South and Redwood Road. 6 people were identified in the Yukon as it pulled into the 7-Eleven. NH, a female, was the driver and the register owner. Mr. Joker was in the front passenger seat. ID, who was a male, was in the second row behind the driver next to a baby, AM. And in the third row, MP, of another female, was sitting next to JG, another male. NH took the Yukon keys and went to the 7-Eleven for snacks with MP and JG moved from the third row to the passenger side of the second row next to ID and the baby, AM. Officer Steinbercher could not see whether Mr. Joker was in the Yukon through the tinted window, but the Find My app confirmed that the phone was still in the Yukon at that time. He at that time called other officers to 7-Eleven so they could block the Yukon in, and when they arrived, he pulled behind the Yukon and turned on his emergency lights. And what this shows you is the placement of the vehicle. So this was Mr. Joker's vehicle. This is the gas pumps that are there. The officers pulled behind him, and he was then blocked in. This also identifies the use of force officers and their relative positions in relationship to the Yukon as I lay out the facts. Mr. Joker began cursing as soon as the police lights turned on. Police detained NH and MP as they walked out of the 7-Eleven, and Officer Steinbercher called everyone else out of the Yukon. ID and JG came out from the second row of the Yukon, leaving only Mr. Joker and the baby inside. Mr. Joker picked up the baby and began lifting it in the front of the passenger window. Police learned that Mr. Joker might be armed. Officers surrounded the Yukon. The gas pumps were on the left, and the police officers and vehicles were directly behind, in front, and to the right of the Yukon. Sergeant Bench from the Unified Police Department heard radio traffic about the incident and responded to the 7-Eleven. He got Mr. Joker's phone from NH and called Mr. Joker. Sergeant Bench asked who else was in the Yukon. Mr. Joker said that there were kids in the car. When Sergeant Bench asked what would it take to get him out, the child out of the Yukon, Mr. Joker asked for a lighter. Sergeant Bench offered to give him a lighter if he let the kids out of the Yukon, and Mr. Joker agreed. At 9:55 p.m., NH used the Yukon's key FOB to open the rear hatch door. Mr. Joker placed the baby in the rear cargo area and moved back to the front of the Yukon. The police retrieved the baby and threw the lighter into the Yukon for Mr. Joker. Mr. Joker, asked for 10 minutes to smoke a blunt and make phone calls before coming out. Police planned to shoot pepper balls into the Yukon through the open rear hatch if Mr. Joker refused to come out. Pepper balls are similar to paintballs, except that they can contain an oleoresin capsium powder. After 10 minutes, Mr. Joker still didn't want to come out because he said he couldn't reach his mom, but he said he would come out if his brother came to the scene. Mr. Joker's brother arrived on the scene at 10:07 p.m. Other friends of Mr. Joker began arriving after he made calls and posted a Snapchat video showing police vehicles surrounding him and the word, quote, shootout, end quote, displayed in the text. We've looked at that. That was something that he put out in social media. Sergeant Ben told Mr. Joker to come out of the Yukon with his hands above his head, or the police may use tactics to get him out. Mr. Joker continued to refuse to come out. At 10:30 p.m., approximately 90 minutes after the Yukon pulled into the 7-Eleven,
West Valley City PD Detective Horn fired 17 pepper balls into the Yukon through the open rear hatch. 8 seconds after the first pepper ball was fired, Mr. Joker opened the front door, passenger door, turned towards the officers, and fired his weapon towards the officers standing astride to the Yukon. As Mr. Joker fired his weapon, and for a total duration of less than 4 seconds, several other officers quickly returned fire, hitting Mr. Joker several times. 3 officers received injuries during this incident. West Valley City Police Detective Mosh received 2 injuries, 1 gunshot wound to his left chest and an injury in the lower leg area. UPD Detective Jared Stillion was injured in his left thigh, and UPD Detective Jerry Valdez was also grazed by an object on his left abdomen. The time span between the first pepper ball fired and the last gunshot fired was 12 seconds. Mr. Joker, of the 11 officers who fired, all officers refused to provide statements, as is their constitutional right to exercise the right to silence. Mr. Joker fired a .40 caliber Glock Model 27 handgun, which was the only .40 caliber firearm used during this whole incident. The gun owner reported it as a stolen gun from a vehicle in Salt Lake City's central neighborhood 10 days earlier on November 21. And let me just pause for a second. Many of you have heard us say this, and I think it's worth repeating. In the last 18 to 24 months, one of the concerns we continue to have, and I want to just take this opportunity again to both highlight and request from our community, please do not leave your guns unattended in vehicles. As I've mentioned before, they have been stolen from those guns, they're not properly secured, and then we find them subsequently being used in other criminal activity. And again, that was the case in this scenario as well. After the incident, investigators found the stolen Glock contained 18 rounds and could hold up to 23 rounds. Thus, it is possible that Mr. Joker fired up to 5 rounds. However, police found only 1 .40 caliber casing on the scene. Mr. Joker was taken by ambulance to St. Mark's Hospital, where he was declared deceased. The Utah Office of Medical Examiner reported 40 gunshot wounds / defects on Mr. Joker's body. The injuries included 4 gunshot wounds to his torso, 3 to his right arm, 5 to his left arm, 4 to his right leg, and 9 to his left leg. West Valley City Police Detective Mosh had 2 injuries, a gunshot wound in his left chest and an injury to his lower left leg. He went to the IMC Medical Center at Murray by ambulance for treatment. The object or objects hitting Detective Mosh's left leg remain currently in his leg. They could not be removed. The bullet entering Detective Mosh's left chest exited his left shoulder. The interior of his ballistic vest stopped it. When West Valley paramedics Andrew Griffin treated Detective Mosh at the scene, he rolled Detective Mosh over to check for an exit wound. He pulled back Detective Mosh's ballistic vest. Paramedic Griffin saw an intact fired bullet fall between the vest and the shirt. He picked up the bullet and handed it to Officer Belcher. Several officers fired their guns during this incident. Even so, Detective Mosh's wounds are consistent with Mr. Joker shooting him and appear incompatible with another officer's shot. As I mentioned, Jared Stillion was apparently hit in his left thigh by an object. We think it was a shrapnel, and Jerry Valdez was also grazed by an object to his left abdomen. The bullet that entered Detective Mosh, as I mentioned, leg remains in his leg and cannot undergo a ballistics analysis. As I mentioned, West Valley Fire paramedic Griffin treated Mosh at the scene. He found the fired bullet and appeared to have traveled through his chest when he rolled him over, and he handed that bullet to Officer Belcher. And Officer Belcher appeared to place the bullet in his left front pants pocket on the night of the incident. That's caught on video. Officer Belcher never logged the bullet into evidence. Investigators asked Officer Belcher about the bullet later. Officer Belcher's attorney said Belcher did not remember receiving a bullet that day. Through his attorney, Officer Belcher said that if he was handed a bullet, he did not remember what happened to the bullet. Unfortunately, this evidence appears to have been lost by Officer Belcher, as it appears he was the last person receiving this evidence as shown on the video, and the bullet now cannot be found. The bullet's absence is unfortunate. It prevents us from determining which gun discharged the bullet that entered Detective Mosh's chest. While it is unlikely, based on the bullet trajectory and the information derived from the facts that we have at hand, that a police officer's gun fired the bullet that hit Detective Mosh, ballistics analysis performed on the missing bullet could have provided a more conclusive result. The relative position of Mr. Joker and the officers provides circumstantial evidence that Mr. Joker shot Detective Mosh. At this time, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to show you a series of videos in terms of what we also relied upon. So this first video is a video that was recovered by the officers as part of our investigations. And what this shows is this is the Yukon. Mr. Joker is here. You can see the back of the vehicle is open, and this is the pathway through which the pepper balls are fired by Officer Horn. As I said, there was about 17 pepper balls that were fired. You'll see smoke that is there, the smoke that will come out, which is the pepper balls, and then we'll go ahead and play this through. Now, what is important for us to notice is that the pepper balls are there, and the door will open. One of the things that we noticed is that you can see the hoodie and the head of Mr. Joker. As the car door opens up, you can see him standing up through there. The other thing that I want to draw that we learned from there is that as we slowed it down, we could also see what looks like there's the hoodie right there. There were two additional facts that we derived from this. One is, although very faint, and when you play it, and we'll play it again for you in a second, you can, when you pay attention in this area, you can see a gun, a arm, and we see the recoil motion of that happens. It happens quickly, and that becomes relevant because when this happens, you will notice in this area, as one bullet casing goes up right there, and you can see it moving, and comes down, hits and down. That's the .40 caliber bullet casing that we found. So we know that at least one shot was fired. Although we did not find other casings, we think that probabilistically maybe 1 to 3 shots may have been fired, but we definitely have a definitive proof of that. So go ahead and play that one. And you can see, as you start to pay attention, you'll see an arm that goes up right there. And that is our conclusion that is consistent with the firing of the weapon and the recoil action that happens with that. And when you can match that, what we see is a recoil action with the bullet casing going up, that is consistent with that shot being fired at that time. Go ahead. And this was another video that we had. This is, as we showed in the previous diagram, the car is in this spot. Mr. Joker's car is here. There's a shield that is here. Officer Mosh is here. There's several officers who are lined up in formation. And this becomes relevant because this actually shows us the point of impact when Officer Mosh is shot. And what happens is that he falls back, and then he's dragged back to safety from there. Pepper balls. There is, in the sequencing,
Expedite medical, expedite medical.
Mr. Joker turns in after he's shot, and then he will eventually drop from there. In the sequencing, we could auditorily hear a burst of pepper balls that go in. There's a small pause. There's a single gunshot, and then there's a subsequent series of fires that is returned from law enforcement. Go ahead. So based on the evidence that we looked at, as I mentioned, all officers who use deadly force refuse to be interviewed by the protocol investigators or provide a statement explaining their use of deadly force. That is their constitutional right. We do not know what the officers' reasoning were, thus cannot say whether they reasonably believed the deadly force was necessary. But we can infer the reasonableness of believing that the deadly force was necessary from the facts that we do know. Here it is reasonable to infer that if the officers who used deadly force against Mr. Joker thought that they needed to do so to prevent the death of others, that would be reasonable. Throughout the evening until the shootout, Mr. Joker conveyed his willingness to endanger and risk people's lives. He was being investigated for sexual assault and for shooting at the alleged victim's residence. While surrounded by police, Mr. Joker posted a snapshot video from the front seat of the Yukon with the word shootout written at the bottom of the screen. He held the infant up for the police to see and only released the infant in exchange for a lighter. Police learned Mr. Joker may have been armed. He lifted a gun after police launched pepper balls into the Yukon. And when he was finally opened the door to exit the Yukon, he began firing towards the police, hitting Detective Mosh. Mr. Joker gave the officers reason to believe that he posed a threat to their lives and deadly force was necessary to prevent the death or serious bodily injury of everyone around. Therefore, we declined to file charges for the use of deadly force with the aforementioned officers, the 11 officers. Furthermore, the facts here and our inferences about the decisions to use deadly force would support a finding that the officers reasonably believed that it was necessary to prevent the death of others. As a result, we believe a reasonable jury would find the elements of the Utah's affirmative legal defense of justification would be satisfied. As such, a jury would therefore find any officers not guilty based on the affirmative defense of justification, which is statutorily created by our state legislature. Finally, there is also insufficient evidence to prove for us as prosecutors beyond a reasonable doubt that the missing bullet was removed with the intent to hinder the investigation. Accordingly, we will not file any obstruction of justice charges at this time. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
You paused for a moment there to ask the public to keep their weapons secured. Tell me your thoughts on that. Have you seen an uptick in these types of weapons being used in crimes?
Over the last 18 months and 24 months, as I've mentioned before, on a couple of occasions, we have pleaded with our community with the proliferation of weapons that are out there that responsible gun owners, please do not leave guns in their cars, and certainly don't leave them unattended and unsecured, because we have had a rash of vehicle burglaries where these guns are being stolen and then they're subsequently being used in crimes that are occurring throughout our valley and throughout our state. And similarly, we've said that to responsible gun owners that when you do have those guns at home, please safely secure them, put them away. So that's something that, again, we've mentioned that on multiple occasions in the past, and we've actually had several officer-involved shootings where those stolen weapons from third parties have ended up in the violence that is and the gun exchange that is going on, as well as subsequent crimes. So that is something that we can take an affirmative step to stem that flow. And again, it just befuddles me that we continue on leaving guns unsecured in often even many times in unlocked cars. So that is something we can address, and I'm going to keep pointing that out, that we all have a responsibility to our communities as lawful gun owners, and please secure and safeguard those weapons.
So you're pretty confident Joker fired more than once, right?
Here's the challenge that we have, Pat, is that I know that he definitely fired one because I can see the casing and we found one. Now, when we do downloads and after police shootings, we can sort of calculate what is the maximum that can be held. Now, did he have maybe only 19 bullets in there? and he fired one, that's also plausible. But one conjecture, and that's exactly what it is a conjecture, because I want to specify, I don't know with definitive certainty, is that his carrying capacity was 23, his down count was 18. And if I'm doing a down count with him just like I do with all the other officers, then that starts to give me the parameters of what that might be, right? And I certainly don't have any proof that seems to indicate that he fired 5 shots. I know he fired 1. He may have gotten another round off. We just didn't find the casing. But that's the range within which possibly he could have done. I know for certain he fired at least 1.
Right, but I guess, by any report, I mean, the West Valley officer was shot twice. You just can't prove, or you don't believe he was shot by friendly fire?
Yes, so that's why we went, because that was one of the things that we were concerned about. Because the way the surrounding occurred, we wanted to make sure that we ruled out through our investigative process everything. Both from the trajectory as the direction of fire comes across, and we listen to the sound sequence of the firing that occurs. We don't have a reason to believe that it was the result of friendly fire in terms of Officer Mosh's shot to his chest, right? Again, one of the things that, again, in the spirit of transparency, there was a piece of evidence that I could have looked at and more conclusively reached that conclusion, because there was a bullet that was there that could have been subjected to forensic analysis and ballistic analysis, by which we could have answered some of those questions. That unfortunately was never logged in, and it was lost. But from the angle and trajectory, we have probabilistically good reason to believe that was not the result. Now, the other 2 officers that had some, we didn't say they're bullets, but there are shrapnel. Now, could that have potentially come from friendly fire or from something like that? That is certainly within the realm of that, because those are not necessarily bullets that are there. We know that there are shrapnel that's there. So where that came from, I couldn't answer.
And there might be some people out there who say, all right, this shooting happened in 2021, and you're just now finding it justified.
Yeah.
And most of the public's mind, it seemed pretty obvious
Sure.
that it was released. So have these officers been off duty for over a year?
I think that each officer agency can do that. They have their own protocols where they go through that analysis, and I believe most of them go back to work, but that's an agency decision. I couldn't answer that. What was kind of odd about this one, it was 11 officers from 6 different agencies, and it implicated officers from each one of our investigative task force. So we had to create an ad hoc task force, and because there were so many different agencies involved, so many different fires, bullets that went through there, we wanted to make sure that we did it as thoroughly as we could. And unfortunately, as I've said before, it falls into the queue of other shootings that we have, so we got it out as soon as we could.
So basically, this one just took a lot of time to put together.
Yeah. And just, I want to make sure that we're thorough, right? I always want to err on the side of thoroughness rather than expediency.
Should you have located that missing piece of evidence, that bullet, and found that it was friendly fire, how would that have changed your conclusion?
Well, it certainly would have. One of the things that we're trying to do, we're doing several things. One thing is to, in a transparent way, share with our community of citizens who have every right to know rightfully what happened. Well, anytime there's a loss of a citizen, regardless of what the context of it might be, I think it is not unreasonable for us to be both transparent and answer in every capacity factually, accurately what happened. The second part of it is that while we can reasonably and probabilistically reach a conclusion, that if you have a piece of evidence that can give you the kind of certainty that you need, then it becomes critical. And finally, like any piece of evidence, there's a process and a protocol to log that in and to retain that evidence. Had Mr. Joker survived and we had to go to trial, that piece of evidence would have become critically substantive for any subsequent prosecution or adjudication that might happen. So again, the goal here is to be transparent, be open, and say this is what we found, this is what we uncovered, this is what the reality of the facts here is, so our community can have all the facts available to them.
You said you declined to file charges against that officer who misplaced that evidence, even though you said you had video evidence of him putting it in his pocket.
Right.
Why did you decline to file charges?
Well, again, the question is, was that done with an intent? I have to explain the mens rea, the mental state, the intent with which to knowingly or intentionally hinder an investigation, right? I don't necessarily have proof of that. What I do have is, as we were going through our body cam video reviews, there is a video that shows the paramedic responding to it, finding that and saying, here's the bullet, and handing it, and he taking and putting it in his pocket, right? So at that point, law enforcement, a state agent, is in possession of evidence. And we have a process and protocol to log that. And as I mentioned, that's what the value of that evidence would have been. This is what happened with it. But can I prove that there was an intentional obstruction? Unless I have other additional evidence, then I could charge that obstruction. But again, in the spirit of transparency, this is where we are. That's what the value is. And I think everybody has a right to know that, and what we looked at and what we found. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much. No, that's it.